Section 1. Harry Brewis is a good person. Mermaids is a charity which works to reduce isolation and loneliness for transgender, non-binary and gender-diverse children, young people and their families. In 2019, after professional bigot Graham Linehan helped orchestrate an email campaign that saw mermaids denied lottery funding, Harry Brewis, aka H-Bomber ran a 57-hour video game stream and ended up raising $340,000 for mermaids. I mention this up top because I want there to be no doubt in anyone's mind going into this. Harry Brewis is a good person, maybe even a great person. Nothing I am going to say about his work over the course of this video can change that. Section 2. I don't care about any of this. I'm not here to relitigate Sherlock, the BBC TV show that ran between 2010 and 2017. I haven't seen it in years, and my memories of the show's quality are decidedly mixed. Ultimately, Sherlock the TV show is irrelevant. Its quality has very little to do with the arguments Harry makes in his video. If Sherlock really was a 100% terrible show, it wouldn't make the points that Harry makes in his video any better. I am not here to defend Sherlock, I'll say it again. I'm here to point out why Harry's video, Sherlock is garbage and here's why, is a combination of bad faith arguments, appeal to ridicule fallacies, and just a whole lot of things that would have him fail out of any half-decent media literacy class. Also, that title is long, and I'm not going to say it each time, so for the rest of the video I'm going to call it Tiddlywinks. Section 3. ADHD. So, if I don't care about the TV show Sherlock, and I don't even really care about Harry Brewis's video Tiddlywinks, why am I making this video? 10 years ago, my life started falling apart, and in late 2021, at age 37, I found out why. I'd been living with undiagnosed ADHD my entire adult life, and living without treatment had essentially been causing my brain to slowly shut down. This video isn't about Tiddlywinks, not really, it's about me trying to understand ADHD. It's about how Harry's video has been following me around since it was first broadcast 4 years ago. ADHD, at least in the way I experience it, can be like having a resonance cascade living inside your head. When I watch something even tangentially connected to Sherlock, my brain throws up Tiddlywinks again, and that's me gone on the thought spiral for the next hour. I finally admitted defeat when I watched the Thoughts Line video and he casually mentioned H-Bomber Guy.
Vaccines, a measured response by H-Bomber Guy.
And my brain went, you haven't done that Sherlock project yet! And it was settled for me again when I watched an Eleanor Morton clip.
Hello, Mr. Conan Doyle. I can't believe you killed Sherlock Holmes, but if you want to bring him back, here's a list of ways you could do that. No, he fell off a waterfall. I'm not bringing him back after that. No, it's pretty foolproof.
And there's no reason why such a tiny reference to Arthur Conan Doyle or to H-Bomber Guy should just set my brain off in a thunderous stampede away from the point. To me, Tiddlywinks feels like a wound that won't close unless I deal with it. Tiddlywinks is the hole in the Amagara fault that was made for me. The question over exactly why I can't get Tiddlywinks out of my head is one I still haven't been able to answer for myself. There are plenty of bad videos on the internet, there are plenty of videos that make bad arguments on the internet. There's this small YouTube channel, I don't know if you've heard of it, it's called PragarU, and they make a specialisation out of bad arguments and completely missing the point deliberately to stoke up people's anger, and that doesn't bother me. Well, it does, but not in the same way. So why is Tiddlywinks different? Is it because some of my friends like it? Does that mean that somewhere down deep in my brain it has categorised Tiddlywinks as something that is important and that I should be thinking about, trying to work out why my friends like it and I don't? That may be true, or it may not. Plenty of my friends like Captain America films and I don't hold that against them. For me, this video you're watching right now is an exorcism. Section 4. Good points Tiddlywinks makes. Number 1. Moriarty is queer-coded in Sherlock. This is obviously a bad thing, and Harry is completely right to call it out. 2. Moriarty's overall motives were shaky at best. It starts off okay, but then when the show stretches out and they keep teasing Moriarty's return, it just gets really bad really quickly. Number 3. Series 4 Episode 3, The Final Problem, was terribad, although personally I think Series 4 Episode 2, The Lying Detective, was actually pretty good, so it's not quite as straightforward as saying all of the last series was bad, but that's just personal opinion. And finally, Sherlock in general has a queer-baiting problem. This has been well covered before by other creators, but it does bear repeating. For some people, these points alone might be enough to consider the show bad. The good parts don't do enough to redeem those points, and that is a completely legitimate position to take. That's one of the many reasons why this video isn't about the TV show Sherlock, it's about Tiddlywinks and the problems that, in my opinion, make it far more comprehensively bad than it should be. Section 5. Serialisation. Harry has a few really key statements in Tiddlywinks which he frames his argument around.
What made the original stories so popular was the fact they were self-contained. Apart from a few scant references to other events or the year the story takes place, nothing connects the Sherlock Holmes stories to each other as a singular narrative. On top of that, Holmes and Watson don't change all that much as people over the course of all those stories. This was hugely beneficial to the impact of the work, because it meant that even though there were tons of stories, a person could get a complete narrative without the idea that they were missing too much if they read one of them. It also meant that since there wasn't a larger overarching plot that needed to be served by each individual story, they all had their own room to breathe. If all the dozens of stories had tied into each other, people would have got confused and bored, and it wouldn't have been as punchy as getting a series of short, complete stories that were all satisfying on their own. This format survives in many adaptations. The 40s serials, for example, don't tie into each other at all, even though there's 14 of them. You can watch Sherlock Holmes and the Pearl of Death, a personal favourite, and never need to see any of the others to know what's going on or feel satisfied. And even in Elementary or House, while there's narratives that run throughout the series, most episodes deal with their own particular one-off mystery and don't have to be all interlinked, so even tuning into a random episode you feel like you got a complete story. I think it's fair to say the episodic nature of Sherlock Holmes is key to its appeal and should remain in any adaptation. Sherlock takes the core concept of the storytelling of Sherlock Holmes and why it works, crumples it up, hides it in one of 6 busts of Napoleon, and then uses them as clubs to kill baby seals.
Now, that clip is 82 seconds long. Harry makes 5-ish points, ignoring him just being a dick at the end, and that's an argument about every 15 seconds. And it is so bad for my ADHD, because Harry says something and my brain will be like, what? No, what? No, is he right? That doesn't sound right. And by the time I can work out whether his point was wrong or not, Harry has already moved on to the next point. This section of my video is about serialisation, narratives that carry over from episode to episode, so I'll address those points and anything else I can answer in a few sentences, but everything else that Harry raises in that 82-second clip, we're going to have to put a pin in so we can come back later. I really can't get distracted, because as we'll see later, distractions can spiral quickly when we're talking about Tiddlywinks.
What made the original stories so popular was the fact they were self-contained.
Citation needed? Maybe. I've got no idea.
Nothing connects the Sherlock Holmes stories to each other as a singular narrative.
Good, great. So this is about serialisation. Pieces of stories that blend into each other, overarching stories, that whole jam. So,
nothing connects the Sherlock Holmes stories to each other as a singular narrative.
That is fully not true. I need to back up so I can take a running jump at this. The first Sherlock Holmes stories are not short stories. Arthur Conan Doyle began the Holmes journey in 1887 with A Study in Scarlet, a novella. Then in 1890 he released The Sign of Four, another novella, and then in 1892 he released the first short story collection, The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes. Now, I am not a Sherlock Holmes expert. I had A Study in Scarlet, Valley of Fear, 1914, Hound of the Baskervilles, 1901, and The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes on cassette tapes when I was young. Shut up, Zoomers, it's not funny. So, The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes has a bunch of famous stories in it. A Scandal in Bohemia, which Harry refers to as a favourite, The Speckled Band, which I'm going to reference later, and a few others which the TV show Sherlock drew from, such as The 5 Orange Pips, The Man with the Twisted Lip, and The Blue Carbuncle. Okay, we're all caught up. So, what I'm going to read you now is from The Adventure of the Blue Carbuncle, which I picked because carbuncle is a funny word. It's the 7th story in the Adventures of Sherlock Holmes collection. So much so, I remarked, that of the last 6 cases which I have added to my notes, 3 have been entirely free of any legal crime. Precisely. You allude to my attempt to recover the Irene Adler papers, to the singular case of Mrs. Mary Sutherland, and to the adventure of the man with the twisted lip. Well, I have no doubt that this small matter will fall into the same innocent category. Oh yeah, I'm going to do silly voices for the characters because I've been reading a lot of audiobooks for my niece and it's really hard to get out of the habit. The point of quoting that section was just to demonstrate that in a story with no connection to Irene Adler or Twisted Lip or Mary Sutherland, Arthur Conan Doyle just throws in a few references for, giggles and to give a sense of continuity between the stories. I didn't go looking for evidence to dispute Harry's clip. I have ADHD and I've already explained that I really don't want to be doing any more work on this than I have to, but the thing about Tiddlywinks is the moment I started looking into the Holmes stories in any way, I immediately started stumbling across counterexamples. There's more connective tissue between the stories than throwaway lines like in The Blue Carbuncle. Moriarty acts as a connecting point between some of Holmes' stories, not just the ones where he physically appears, from the 1914 novel The Valley of Fear, epilogue. Jack has been lost overboard in the gale off St. Helena. No one knows how the accident occurred. Ha! It came like that, did it? Said Holmes thoughtfully. Well, I've no doubt it was well stage managed. You mean that it was no accident? None in the world. He was murdered? Surely. So I think also this infernal scourers, the cursed vindictive nest of criminals. No, my good sir, said Holmes, there is a master at hand here. It is no case of sawn-off shotguns and clumsy six-shooters. You can tell an old master by the sweep of his brush. I can tell a Moriarty when I see one. This crime is from London, not from America. So Moriarty is teased in a Valley of Fear at the start and the end, very like a post-credit scene in a Marvel film. And does Harry mind when they do post-credits in Marvel films that aren't linked to the main plot of the Marvel film? No, sorry, I'm getting distracted.
Since there wasn't a larger overarching plot that needed to be served by each individual story, they all had their own room to breathe.
And the implication of that sentence is that Sherlock the show doesn't give individual mysteries room to breathe, and I can't get into that without talking about the quality of Sherlock the show, which is beyond the scope, so let's skip over it.
If all the dozens of stories had tied into each other, people would have got confused and bored, and it wouldn't have been as punchy as getting a series of short, complete stories that were all satisfying on their own.
I see two problems with this point. First, the way Harry phrases things is quite binary. He doesn't consider the idea that some short stories could tie into each other whilst others wouldn't. His point focuses on the idea that if all, rather than some, of the short stories had tied into each other, that would have been confusing. I think this is a simplistic way of looking at things. Second, Harry's claim that people would have got confused if the stories had all tied into each other needs a big citation needed tag applied to it. Short stories can tie into each other, be satisfying to the reader, and avoid confusion if people read the stories out of order. A brilliant example of this in action comes from Andrzej Sapkowski's Witcher short story collections, The Last Wish and Sword of Destiny.
Even in Elementary or House, while there's narratives that run throughout the series, most episodes deal with their own particular one-off mystery and don't have to be all interlinked, so even tuning into a random episode you feel like you got a complete story.
Harry's point has shifted here from the stories tying into each other would confuse people to the episodes tying into each other is fine, as long as you tell a complete story in one episode. The problem is, he doesn't explain why that applies to House and Elementary, but not to Sherlock. We'll be coming back to that later, but since we're talking about House, here's a clip from when Harry was talking about other Sherlock Holmes adaptations.
And there's perhaps an uncountable amount of books, shows, films and other properties directly inspired by or based on the stories and characters. One of the most obvious and best in recent history being House MD, a show I've seen all the way through multiple times, starring Hugh Laurie as Dr. House, and Robert Sean Leonard as Dr. James Wilson. Do you get it? And
House MD has so many serialised elements. There are so many story arcs that span multiple episodes, but the House Wiki has compiled a list of the things. I don't know how anyone can think Sherlock Holmes adaptations should not have any ongoing story arcs if they like House. Harry said he's seen the whole thing multiple times. Was he asleep during Series 4? That whole thing was about House replacing his team from Series 1 to 3. Anyway, back to the 82-second clip.
I think it's fair to say the episodic nature of Sherlock Holmes is key to its appeal and should remain in any adaptation.
To talk about this, we're going to need to talk about the format that art exists in, which is going to have to be its own section. We'll put a pin in it and come back. And then at the end, Harry is a dick for 20 seconds. The end of that 82-second clip out of a 2-hour video. I originally didn't want to do this, but I think demonstrating the trouble I had keeping Harry's argument straight in my head for 82 seconds justifies it. I had to make a spreadsheet tracking every point that Harry made across his 2-hour video and how that fits into his wider arguments. Having ADHD is not fun. Back to serialisation.
A Scandal in Bohemia wasn't going to be made any better by being part of some long-running intellectual magic mind battle between Sherlock and a gay supervillain. So Arthur Conan Doyle didn't bother, and instead focused on telling one of the most popular and compelling mystery stories in the entire Western fucking canon.
Two things. Arthur Conan Doyle didn't add Moriarty to A Scandal in Bohemia because he thought it wouldn't have added anything, but he added it to the Valley of Fear. Why does it ruin A Scandal in Bohemia in the TV show, and not the novel Valley of Fear, Harry? We'll come back to that. But notice the reverence with which Harry refers to Arthur Conan Doyle's work.
So Arthur Conan Doyle didn't bother, and instead focused on telling one of the most popular and compelling mystery stories in the entire Western fucking canon.
Put a pin in that, we're going to have to come back to that in a big way. Harry says Series 1 of Doctor Who is his favourite.
In the first series, which is still my favourite, they would have the Doctor do something shitty like torture a Dalek, and he would have to confront himself that episode and get better as a person.
And when he talks about Series 1, he never mentions Bad Wolf. Bad Wolf was a pair of words that cropped up in most episodes of Series 1 of Doctor Who. It turns out they were sent through time by Rose. Now, Harry never mentions Bad Wolf. Presumably he likes it, or at least didn't mind it. I can't imagine Harry hates Bad Wolf and would neglect to mention that, given all the stuff he talks about tiny serialised elements intruding on otherwise unrelated episodes. So it's fair to assume he at least doesn't mind Bad Wolf. So how does Harry feel about Doctor Who Series 5?
When Moffat has to write the whole series and manage the wider progression, you start to see holes. Things start being implied that sound deep, seem like they might be going somewhere, but actually don't. His first season starts with the Doctor finding a crack in space and time on the bedroom wall of a girl he happens to run into, and then the cracks keep turning up and a piece of the TARDIS comes through one. Where did the cracks come from? Keep watching and maybe you'll find out. Then it turns out they come from the TARDIS exploding at the end of the season. But why did the TARDIS explode? Keep watching and maybe you'll find out. Oh, the silence did it? Maybe? I'm still not clear. Why did they do it? Well, keep watching and maybe you'll find... Oh, they did it because there's a prophecy that silence must fall when the question is asked. Who made this prophecy and what the hell does it mean? Keep watching for yet another fucking season and maybe...
Harry argues that Stephen Moffat, the writer of Doctor Who at the time, has no talent for writing large narrative arcs and should stick to single episodes, or at least double bills. This is extremely odd, because the structure of Bad Wolf and the cracks in time from Series 5 of Doctor Who are very, very similar. Harry says he doesn't like the cracks because they fold into Series 6's narrative about the silence, but that's not how story structure works. Series 5 starts by asking a question: what is the crack in Amy's wall? This is answered pretty quickly. It's
2 parts of space and time that should never have touched. Pressed together.
But the cracks appear in more places throughout the rest of the series, so we have a new question. What was the cause of these cracks? By the end of the series, this is answered. It was caused by the TARDIS exploding. And at the end of the series, as in it's literally the last thing that happens, the Doctor asks a new question. Why did the TARDIS blow up and who was responsible? It's a completely different question to what's going on with the cracks in time. That story about the cracks is done. Series 5 and Series 6 are linked, one follows on from the other, but it's a stretch to say that the story of Series 5 never ends because Series 6 builds on the story of Series 5. To return to Bad Wolf, you know how the Bad Wolf story leads to Rose absorbing the time vortex which causes the Doctor to regenerate, and Series 2 is about this new Doctor? That's a very similar sort of link between Series 5 and Series 6. Now, I have no idea why Harry hates one of these and not the other, unless he has a bone specifically to pick with Stephen Moffat, and he'll say basically anything if it lets him rag on the guy some more. Now, I need to move on from serialisation because we all have places to be, but I have one final point.
You can have all the fantastic premises you like, shrinking yourself down to go inside a Dalek to do surgery, having a sword fight with Robin Hood with a spoon, having to go on a space bank heist with strangers, whatever. But if most of the time the conclusion is, wow, you've got some anger, Doctor, I bet a future episode might bother to deal with it, those episodes are wasting a lot of their potential.
Harry says that Doctor Who episodes like Time Heist are bad because they don't contribute to the overall continuity. Are serialised elements bad or are they not, Harry? Make up your mind. Ultimately, the problem is this. Harry says serialisation in Sherlock is bad because the source material didn't do it. We've established that isn't true, but what if it was? What if there was genuinely no continuity between Arthur Conan Doyle's home stories? We'll get into this more when we talk about format, but to me, the ultimate problem is this. Harry never digs into why he thinks serialised elements ruin Sherlock, but they don't ruin other shows. Let's go back to House, given Harry says he loves House.
Even in Elementary or House, while there's narratives that run throughout the series, most episodes deal with their own particular one-off mystery and don't have to be all interlinked, so even tuning into a random episode you feel like you've got a complete story.
But from my memory of the TV show Sherlock, and the brief checking I've done for this video, that's also true of Sherlock, and Harry doesn't explain the difference between the two. The question I'm left with is, why does Harry think it works in House and not in Sherlock? It can't be a quality issue, remember, because there were some hella bad story arcs in House. I mentioned this up top because I think the Moriarty storyline's pretty bad, but Moriarty isn't in every episode of Sherlock. I do not like Moriarty, but I do not think a mention of Moriarty ruins A Study in Pink. I do not think Mycroft showing up in A Study in Pink ruins that episode. Similarly, I don't think Mycroft's presence in The Hounds of Baskerville ruined that episode. Being written by Mark Gatiss is what ruined that one. So, put yourself in my shoes for a minute. You like some episodes of Sherlock, but not others. And then you watch Tiddlywinks, and Tiddlywinks is hitting the serialisation argument again and again. The presence of connective tissue between episodes ruins that episode. And if you're not convinced by the argument that Arthur Conan Doyle's stories didn't have serialisation, so it's heresy to include it, why is the serialisation a problem? And Harry never, ever answers that question. He never digs past his own assumptions about Sherlock Holmes stories to actually talk about the point past the source material didn't do it, so Sherlock bad. Section 6, dealing with our very first pin, adventures in formatting.
I think it's fair to say the episodic nature of Sherlock Holmes is key to its appeal and should remain in any adaptation.
I'm going to start off by being offensively simplistic. Short stories and TV are different. What works for one won't necessarily work for another. A 45-minute episode of Sherlock is longer than a direct translation of a short story, so there is more room to play, to experiment, and to include overarching plots, like House does. Whilst we're talking about format, because this is going to come up again, let's talk about protagonists. There is this idea that Watson being the protagonist in the Holmes stories is a core component of those stories. It's assumed, we'll get to an example later, that this is because Watson is the audience surrogate. That's a simple answer, we could leave it there, but I'm not content with it, I demur. The genre of Sherlock Holmes is something we're going to have to come back to, like almost everything else I've talked about so far, so for now, let's talk about a series of bona fide mystery novels like the Hercule Poirot stories. In case you don't know, the Poirot stories are the sort of thing Harry should love. They are beloved because Agatha Christie set up intricate mysteries and then gave the reader all the tools they needed to solve it. And, this is amazing, there are YouTube videos of people doing just that.
Okay, this case is haunting me, but we have some progress because we've learned some more information and I have a few theories, so I'm gonna sound them out with you. So first of all, just to really quickly run you through the few basic points that we've learned since last time. We learned that the butler wasn't aware of the blackmail, I might have already said this, that Mrs. Farrows was going through. Parker did not know that she was being blackmailed.
In case you've never read any Agatha Christie, I really recommend at least watching And Then There Were None. It's not a traditional murder mystery, but it has Christie's trademark puzzle box approach to plot, and it's really good. Poirot's stories are definite mysteries that the reader can solve. Do they have a Watson character to act as an audience surrogate? Some of them, yes. Hastings fills the Watson role. I won't quote these because they go on, but pachow. Some of the stories have other narrators, like The Murder of Roger Ackroyd, pachow. But some of the books are told from an omniscient narrator, like Death on the Nile and Murder on the Orient Express. So clearly, some puzzle box narratives work with an audience surrogate character and others don't. So what is it about Watson that makes him the constant presence in Arthur Conan Doyle's stories? In my opinion, and this is only my opinion but we'll get back to that a little more later, Watson is present because the Holmes stories are not a puzzle the audience are expected to solve. Genre conventions weren't set in the 1890s, but if you look at how Holmes and Watson operate, let's take a section from The Adventure of the Blue Carbuncle. I'm going to edit this because it's extremely long, but I'll put the full thing on the screen. Then what clue would you have as to his identity? Only as much as we can deduce. From his hat! Precisely. But you are joking! What could you gather from his old battered felt? Here is my lens, you know my methods. I took the tattered object in my hands and turned it over rather ruefully. It was a very ordinary black hat and the usual round shape. I can see nothing, said I, handing it back to my friend. On the contrary, Watson, you can see everything. You fail, however, to reason from what you see. That the man was highly intellectual is of course obvious upon the face of it. How did you deduce that this man was intellectual? For answer, Holmes clapped the hat upon his head and it came right over the forehead and settled upon the bridge of his nose. It is a question of cubic capacity, said he. A man with so large a brain must have something in it. That section is really damned long, and it's just dialogue where Holmes explains things to Watson that he's noticed and deduced. Watson gets a bit of time to notice some things, but he doesn't make any conclusions, and fully half of Holmes's observations aren't even noticed by Watson. So let's posit a world where Holmes was the first-person narrator rather than Watson. We'd get his story happen in real time rather than told after the fact, which, in The Blue Carbuncle, wouldn't actually make that much difference because Holmes wasn't the person that noticed the robbery, but let's say Holmes was taking Peterson's place, so Holmes noticed the robbery, got the goose, got the hat. That would actually be better because we'd see more of the action. Holmes would witness the robbery. Is Holmes in danger? Who knows? What are the ruffians going to do? Who knows? That side would be much better, but then we'd get all of Holmes' stream of consciousness observations as he had them, and that would be terrible in a book. But just because it would be terrible in a book, that doesn't mean it would be terrible in another format. Imagine if, for example, we could have the best of both worlds, where we are in the thick of the action with Holmes, so not everything is based off explaining stuff to Watson after the fact, but at the same time we get to see Holmes' observations and deductions in real time. Maybe something like this. Ultimately, this is a matter of personal taste, because adapting things from one format to another requires you to change certain things. I think it makes sense to change what you need to in order to make the project good. I don't think it's different, therefore it's bad, is much of an argument, but plenty of people do. I disagree, but that doesn't make them wrong. That's not how art works. If we wanted an example of how Harry could have approached Tiddlywinks, we could look at a Lindsay Ellis video. Pocahontas was a mistake, and here's why.
Pocahontas' design, a trope as old as the hills. By the time Pocahontas came out, the only other Disney princess arguably as sexualized as Pocahontas was Princess Jasmine, and the year after that, Esmeralda.
Look at that disgusting display. Yes, sir.
Funny that.
Well, how do you do?
According to an interview with Glenn Keane from 1995, we are doing a mature love story here, and we have to draw her as such. She has to be sexy. This is a Disney version. This is not a documentary. This may seem, harmless, but these media trends mirror very real problems in the real world to this day. Even now, Native American women are twice the national average in reported rapes and sexual assault, and those are just the ones that get reported. Media trends of sexualizing Indigenous women do not exist in a bubble.
In a very small period of time, Linz talks about the problems with Disney's design for Pocahontas, she draws sexualization comparisons to 3 other princesses of colour, references an interview with one of the artists, and explains why the sexualization is a problem, linking to a news article to back her point up. She makes a point, places it in context, and backs up her argument with multiple sources, all in less than a minute. So, with that in mind, let's get back to Tiddlywinks. Section 7. Harry, would you please show your work? As explained, I don't think it's sufficient for Harry to say some of the Doyle short stories weren't serialised, so none of the TV show Sherlock should be serialised. I don't think that's sufficient. I want to know why Harry thinks that's the case. Of course, he doesn't need to do this for every point he raises. When he points out Moriarty's queer coding, for example.
There's also the problem of him being relentlessly queer-coded.
Okay.
But the flirting's over, Sherlock. Daddy's had enough now.
Seriously, this guy's just the fucking most.
You like my boys? This one's got more stamina, but he's less caring in the afterglow.
What are you doing, Andrew? Oh boy, do you get it? He's a queen? Oh, fuck you, Steve.
Harry provides examples of the coding and assumes we're knowledgeable enough to understand what queer coding is and why it's a problem when it's applied to villains, particularly predatory ones like Moriarty. I don't see the need to add anything else here. 10 out of 10, no notes. When he points out Moriarty's story arc doesn't make much sense, things get a little more interesting.
He kills himself because I guess they wanted him to do something surprising.
The most essential thing about Moriarty for me is that you don't know what you're going to get on the day, that he has to be completely surprising.
So they had him do the stupidest fucking thing possible. The only way this could be stupider is if, right before he shot himself in the head for no reason, he told Sherlock he was going to come back for every season finale afterwards as an increasingly stupid and bullshit fake-out, or that Sherlock has a secret sister he magically forgot about, and also a mega super double secret old best friend who he remembers as a dog for some reason, and who the sister killed. That would be really stupid, wouldn't it? But Moriarty's shitty characterization doesn't end there. After the big twist in season 2 that there is no secret all-powerful hacking technology...
No. It's too easy. It's too easy. There is no key. You don't really think a couple of lines of computer code are going to crash the world around our ears? I'm disappointed. I'm disappointed in you.
It turns out that it does exist, because this happens.
Harry starts off by saying that the creators wanted Moriarty's actions to be surprising, so they had him kill himself, and Harry thinks that's stupid. It's a place where I would really have liked more detail, because a villain who is genuinely so unpredictable that they will kill themselves in order to ensure the downfall of the protagonist, to me that sounds really interesting, dark as hell, but yeah, I think that's a good idea. The onus is on Harry to explain why it didn't work in the execution. Harry then rattles through a few points. Moriarty's teased return is bad, no argument here. Sherlock having a secret sister is bad, no argument here. And Sherlock having forgotten his best friend, who is also a dog in his head, is bad. I agree with all those points, but let's for the moment say I didn't. Harry doesn't go into any explanation as to why any of those things are bad. He didn't need much, just a few sentences. Something like, in Series 4, the show introduces a sister for Sherlock who has never been mentioned before, and that Sherlock has forgotten about. The explanation given is that Sherlock doesn't remember her, because he was traumatized by actions she took, but for this to not feel as if it comes out of nowhere, they needed to seed this trauma better throughout the earlier episodes. The idea that Sherlock has deep trauma could easily have come up when Mycroft interviews John in Series 1, for example, but it didn't. It's never been mentioned before, so it feels like the writers have been scrambling around for a way to explain a new villain, rather than having the new villain fit into the show in a way which doesn't conflict with the previous episodes. There you go. Secret Sister doesn't work because the explanation for her being a secret conflicts with what the show has established so far. Not much more needed than that. Harry didn't necessarily need to back up the point about Sherlock's sister. He can't reasonably be expected to back up every point he makes, after all. It's not exactly a problem that he didn't back his point up at all. It only becomes a problem when Harry uses the same approach on points which are slightly more nuanced than queer coding a predatory villain is bad. It's hard to demonstrate that someone doesn't talk about something, so I'm going to deliberately leave a little bit at the end of each of these clips just to show that Harry makes a surface level point and then moves on without backing his point up any.
There's a scene in the first Sherlock episode, A Study in Pink, ooh, do you get it? How clever! Where Sherlock goes to a crime scene clearly based on the one from Scarlet. Rach here is written by the victim, and it actually turns out that she really is trying to write the name Rachel, because knowing German, I guess, is too much to expect of an audience. This isn't necessarily a bad change. What is a bad change is what information Sherlock learns and how he learns it. We're shown Sherlock inspecting the body and instead making the conclusion, based on the inside of a dirty wedding ring being clean, that the woman is a serial adulterer. This actually doesn't have very much impact on the story whatsoever, it's just the writers finding a way to be clever by having Sherlock derive an entire sexual history from a ring. He then realises
First, he says the creators changing the meaning of Rash to Rachel is because the show thinks the audience is too stupid to know German, but isn't that an Easter egg for people who've read the book? I don't know. It seems a little in bad faith to go ahead and just assume that the show changed the Rash to Rachel because it thinks the audience is stupid, but let's move on. He then says the bad change in this clip is the information Sherlock learns and how he learns it. Sherlock learns that the victim's coat was wet, which he found out by stroking it. He checks the umbrella and then strokes that to find it dry. He removes her wedding ring and finds the inside is clean whilst the outside is dirty, concluding she removed it often and that she was a serial adulterer. So the closest thing to a reason we're given for why this is a bad change is Harry says,
this actually doesn't have very much impact on the story whatsoever, it's just the writers finding a way to be clever by having Sherlock derive an entire sexual history from a ring.
However, if we skip back in the video a bit, we can see how he views the equivalent scene in A Study in Scarlet, the Arthur Conan Doyle novel.
Sherlock looks at this scene and deduces, for example, the approximate height of the person who wrote the message based on where it had made sense for them to write the letters. Something no one else in the room thought to observe or consider, but something that you could absolutely arrive at yourself. This is a tangible piece of information that you yourself could apply to real life. Sherlock just taught you how to figure out how tall someone is based on how they would naturally write on a wall or the length of the stride of their footprints. This characterization is very strong because it gets across that Sherlock is smart, but also why he's smart, what he did to learn the things he learned, and got across the point of the scene, which is to demonstrate the use of his analytical techniques.
So the "you could absolutely arrive at yourself" line? That's dubious. The description that the reader gets in A Study in Scarlet is, "I've remarked that the paper had fallen away from the wall in parts. In this particular corner of the room, a large piece had peeled off, leaving a yellow square of coarse plastering. Across this bare space, there was in blood-red letters a single word, Rash." So we know Rash is in a corner, but not if it's a high or a low corner. Maybe some readers could have guessed the murderer's height from that, but I certainly couldn't. Harry says that
Sherlock just taught you how to figure out how tall someone is based on how they would naturally write on a wall or the length of the stride of their footprints.
That might have been a good argument back in the 1890s, but now there might be better ways you could learn crime solving than from Arthur Conan Doyle. Remember in The Adventure of the Blue Carbuncle, Doyle wrote Holmes saying that you could link intelligence to the size of someone's head. Maybe not the best information in 2022. More on that when we get to The Adventure of the Speckled Band. And then Harry says it's a good section of the book because it shows us Sherlock's process.
This characterization is very strong because it gets across that Sherlock is smart, but also why he's smart, what he did to learn the things he learned, and got across the point of the scene, which is to demonstrate the use of his analytical techniques.
That's exactly the same as in A Study in Pink. The two scenes work in the same way, showing Sherlock's process. I fully don't get what Harry's point here is. Finally, Harry initially said that the changes in A Study in Pink were bad because the changes weren't super relevant to catching the killer, whereas if we compare that to A Study in Scarlet, the killer's height, stride, and a bunch more other facts besides have little, if anything, to do with solving the case. Holmes solves the case by working out that the murderer drove a cab because of wheel tracks in the mud outside, working out what links the two victims, and paying a bunch of street urchins to go around the cab companies asking for the murderer by name. Remember those street urchins, we'll be coming back to those. Next!
This is a vast improvement on Jekyll, which appears to have been rushed and had no budget, so you get stuff like Hyde's super strength being shown off by having them just fast forward footage of James Nesbitt walking normally, or this shot. You can see the bones of the style Moffat and the production team of Sherlock finally get the budget to actually make, but it just doesn't work. This is meant to be Hyde drinking a lot of alcohol very quickly because of his advanced metabolism and unexplained superpowers, but it just looks like a guy drinking in fast forward, and the sound effects just make it silly. A lot of the special effects in scenes that are meant to be scary are just Dutch angles and shaky cam with undercrank and weird filters. Sherlock's enhanced budget and scope of production.
Oh yeah, I forgot to mention, Harry spends a while talking about the 2007 TV drama Jekyll. It's got nothing to do with Sherlock other than it was written by Stephen Moffat, put a pin in that. Harry says Jekyll's cheap effects look bad. He never really explains why, other than it's clearly sped up, which, I mean, the effect is to demonstrate Hyde's speed by having him move extremely quickly, so yes, he looks sped up. This argument wouldn't have problems to it if there was any depth to Harry's argument other than it's sped up so it looks cheap. Plus, later in Tiddlywinks, he says,
"You see, one thing Doctor Who was quite famous for was shooting for expensive ideas and concepts so often, with such tight schedules, that it becomes necessary for there to be episodes where the main characters don't make too much of an appearance and there aren't too many effects or expensive props. Within these constraints, Moffat himself wrote Blink, one of the most universally loved episodes of the show, where the Doctor and Martha barely show up and the monsters literally don't even move, creating some incredibly tense moments out of almost no budget whatsoever. Such as this sphincter tightening scene of a light starting to flicker."
So he's clearly in favour of cheap effects sometimes, if only he'd explained the difference between how the two techniques are applied, one in Blink, one in Jekyll. This could be genuinely a really interesting discussion. There could be good points to make here, if only Harry had made them. Maybe Harry could have compared the Quicksilver scene in that X-Men film with this scene from Jekyll, and explained why the Quicksilver scene works and the Jekyll clip doesn't.
Oh, and for some reason a bunch of characters and lines that could have been ripped whole cloth from coupling start turning up in this horror drama 4 episodes in. But the show even commits, in my opinion based on what I liked about it, the cardinal sin. It shows the backstory. The 4th episode is almost entirely long flashbacks showing Jackman gaining the condition and starting to discover it and figure out how to manage it. That's right. Moffat starts in media res, smartly skipping explaining an origin story that's not necessary for getting to the interesting bits that take place in the 1st episode, and then goes back to explain it. The show ends with Jackman's mother, who has appeared intermittent.
Whilst we're talking about Jekyll, Harry says it's bad that Jekyll starts in medias res with the interesting stuff and then shows the backstory later, and says it's not necessary, but why is it not necessary, dude? Did we already know the backstory? Could we have intuited it? Is it boring? Is the sequence bad? Also, I should mention that A Study in Scarlet devotes 15,000 words of its 40,000 word count. That's about 34% to the murderer's backstory after the murderer has been caught, and in The Valley of Fear more than half of the story is filling in the backstory after the mystery has been revealed. We already have 2 pins in the point about Harry's grasp of the source material that he admires, so a 3rd needs to go in, sorry. And finally,
in the pilot, Sherlock fucking around trying to be clever gets him captured by the cab driver, who figures out that he's been found out and drugs him. You even get a cool exchange setting up Sherlock's previous drug problems.
Do a lot of drugs, Sherlock Holmes?
Not in a while.
I ask because you're very resilient. Most people would have passed out by now.
This is far better at setting up Sherlock's drug stuff than having the cops be at his place looking for drugs and mentioning he used to have a problem, and then he walks out and gets into the cab. It's like a fucking Mad Libs Chinese telephone version of the plot of the pilot. It's so dumb.
Harry says a version of the unbroadcast pilot of Sherlock is better than the broadcast version, but what he's missing here is the word because. The unbroadcast pilot is better than the broadcast pilot because. Why, Harry? Why is it better? I haven't seen the unbroadcast pilot, and I know you know that I haven't because it was unbroadcast. I really need some more detail. What about it is better than the broadcast version? Genuinely, this could have been a really interesting discussion. There could well be good points to make here. I don't see one as being better or worse than the other, because I haven't got enough information. Come on, Harry, I'm open to this. Give me a reason why I should consider one version superior. Give me any argument, give me any evidence, say anything other than one good, one bad. Oh, well, it's not that big a deal. I guess Harry just needs us to trust him. Put a pin in it. A probably intentional effect of Harry not backing up his points, by the way, is that the video moves at a heck of a clip. Section 8. Pacing. I'm sure you remember those 82 seconds that so confused me earlier as viscerally as I do, but I don't know if you remember how quickly Harry moved from point to point in those 82 seconds. Harry moving across points so quickly means that he is able to maintain a jokey, sardonic tone, and I don't think it was a great idea to sacrifice giving any depth of your argument for the sake of being funny, but it looks like that's the choice that Harry made. When you make jokey media criticism, you have to decide which is more important, the criticism or the jokes. Lindsay Ellis strikes this balance rather well, but her videos are actually interested in analysing the things she's talking about. Harry, by contrast, is focused on making jokes. For example, the last line of Tiddlywinks is a joke.
Also, Benedict Cumberbatch is a terrible actor and his face is stupid.
The joke is that Benedict Cumberbatch is a bad actor, or maybe the joke is that Harry says that Benedict Cumberbatch is a bad actor and he doesn't really think that and he's just doing it to annoy people. I assume it's a joke. It's said in the same tone as the rest of the video, so it might not be, but jokes like this act as a shield for all of Tiddlywinks' worst points. If a bad point is raised or a bad argument is used, people can defend the video by saying it's only a joke, but is it? Which bits in Tiddlywinks are jokes, obvious overstatements that aren't meant to be legit criticism, and which bits does Harry sincerely believe? Because both the jokes and the serious points are made in the same irreverent tone, and both are rarely, if ever, given evidence to support them. The problem isn't that Tiddlywinks makes jokes, the problem is people watch it and think it's making legit points, when it so rarely is. For evidence to back up this claim, please spend 5 minutes reading the Tiddlywinks comments. But I have a couple for you just in case you don't want to. I do have to give Moffat props for successfully brainwashing an entire community of preteens on the internet into thinking this show is incredibly intelligent and complex for most of the 2010s. 1,700 people gave that a thumbs up, and I think one of the biggest issues is that Moffat sees himself as Sherlock, not Watson. The majority of the audience, and myself, view ourselves as inserts to Watson, as the normal but not stupid person, but due to Moffat's midlife crisis, he thinks he is Sherlock, and that screws up the whole structure. 7,600 people gave that a thumbs up. Oh hey look, it's that Watson is the audience surrogate in the books, so that also has to be the case for any adaptation, whether it's right for the format or not argument again. Fun! By the way, I have a question for anyone who's played Sherlock Holmes games, because I have played none of them. Who is the character you play as in the Sherlock Holmes games? Sherlock or Watson? It doesn't make any difference on this argument, I'm just interested.
In the first series, which is still my favourite, they would have the Doctor do something shitty like torture a Dalek, and he would have to confront himself that episode and get better as a person. Say what you want about Russell T Davies, but under his watch almost every episode would feel involving because characters would change or grow or have to actually confront and deal with something about themselves.
Why don't you finish the job and make the Daleks extinct? Rid the universe of your filth! Why don't you just die?
You would make a good Dalek.
This episode explores the Doctor's anger at the Daleks and shows it's an expression of seeing his entire race die in a war with them. Over the course of this episode, he has to confront these feelings in ways he hasn't let himself and grow as a person. It's a really small change, but we get to see it happen, and it's good.
That clip really hurts my brain, because Harry says, in Russell T Davies' Doctor Who, characters would change nearly every episode. Is that true? I don't think it is, but I could check, I suppose. And how are we defining change, anyway? I remember characters growing in a few episodes, like Father's Day, but no, sorry, no, I'm getting distracted. Why is Harry talking about Russell T Davies' Doctor Who, anyway? Oh yes, he's comparing it to Stephen Moffat's Doctor Who. Why is he talking about Stephen Moffat's Doctor Who? Oh yes, there's a wider point about how Stephen Moffat can't write ongoing story, which I've already kind of dealt with by talking about the cracks in time from Series 5, but that's a bit bare bones. I could do some more, I suppose. There's a lot to talk about with Series 9 and Clara, but... Do you see how someone with ADHD might struggle with Tiddlywinks? Fundamentally, I think Harry isn't interested in whether the TV show Sherlock is good or not. He certainly has no interest in why certain bits work and other bits don't. He just wants to be snarky about it, which would be fine if it was, oh I don't know, an Alistair Beckett King sketch.
Let's talk to this inexplicably Welsh alien. Help us, Doctor. We are the last of our people. The intransigent Implacablons are poised to destroy us. Have you tried talking to them about how brilliant you are? For ages? Yes, that was the first thing we tried. That usually works. All right, I'll kill them. Oh, thank you, Doctor.
The thing is, Harry didn't want to make a funny video making some dubious points about Sherlock in a sketch comedy sort of style, although he does occasionally include some sketch style bits.
Alright, if you take this pill, you wake up in your bed and the Sherlock TV series was never made, it was all a bad dream. If you take this pill, you have to watch all of it. Again.
Oh, cool. What do you want me to return? Do I need to, like, suck your dick or something?
What? No, I'm gonna shoot you if you don't take either pill, but you've got to take one. That's all.
Really? Wow, you just talked yourself out of a sweet deal, mister.
Oh.
Sign me the fuck up, sailor.
I forgot where I was going with this bit, I'm sorry.
But he wasn't content with that. Instead, he made a video which is trying to be funny, like Alistair Beckett King's videos, and insightful, like Lindsay Ellis's, but in my opinion, he achieved neither, and it's 2 hours long. I can't stress enough that I do not want to be making this video. I do not want Tiddlywinks taking up this much space in my head. It's been there for 4 years. I would dearly like for the video I'm currently making to be shorter. I want this to be over, but I'm really, really worried that if I stop before I get to the worst parts of Tiddlywinks, the exorcism won't work. So let's move on to the parts where Harry's argument loses all merit. Section 9, Stylisation. To start, we need to go back to that scene from A Study in Pink, and let's focus on one particular moment. In this scene, a woman lies dead, poisoned. With her dying moments, she scratched the word rash into the floorboards. We've already been through the purpose of the text popping up onto the screen. It's so that the audience can experience the observations and deductions at the same time as Sherlock, so he doesn't have to explain everything to Watson after the fact. The next bit is going to be all about sound. Let me tell you what I think the sound effects are doing in this scene, and you can see if you agree. To me, the sound effects of the nails scratching into the wood when combined with the visual result hints at the pain that must have been felt in that moment. When I see that scene, the contrast of the living moment, the sounds of the nail scratching, contrasts wonderfully with the dead moment, the writing in the wood and the dead hand lying nearby. It allows me to link the two ideas in my head and reflect a little on how it must have felt to be so desperate as to spend the final moments of one's life scratching letters into a floorboard. It's not a big moment, it's not a particularly important moment, but I think it's a good one. So what does Tiddlywinks say about it?
When Sherlock's using his mind powers, because let's be honest, that's basically what they are, the soundtrack swells and all kinds of cool sound effects are used to get across his sheer attentiveness. Here, for example, because she was scraping the ground with her nails, as the text appears you hear a nail scraping sound. Giving the text a sound effect as it writes itself in helps draw your attention to it, make it pop.
Tiddlywinks ignores any textual reason for the sounds of the nails scratching against wood, any artistic purpose, any reason the creators might have had to put it there, and just asserts that it's for emphasis. Huh, weird. The last time we were looking at this scene, Harry said that Sherlock didn't use the German version of rash because the audience was too stupid for German.
H here is written by the victim, and it actually turns out that she really is trying to write the name Rachel, because knowing German, I guess, is too much to expect of an audience.
And here's another bad faith interpretation of the same scene. Weird. Oh well, moving on.
Nudging the numbers, you've been over the last 4 digits yourself and another pen, so you wanted to keep the number. Just now they used the napkin to blow your nose. Maybe you're not that into her after all.
They use pen drawing and nose sniffling noises when he talks about those, and you can even see they animate the images as it happens. They do this because they think you're an idiot and don't understand what writing with a pen means, so you need both visual and audio cues.
Okay, so apparently this bad faith stuff is something Tiddlywinks is determined to stick with. What Harry has done here is take something he doesn't like, in this case putting sound effects over an image, and he's decided to assign malice to it. He's decided that the only reason the sound effects could be over that particular image is a malicious reason. He's ignoring any artistic reason for the audio of the pen and the nose blowing, and moving straight to the creators hate the audience. I think there's a reason to have the sound effects of a pen writing and the nose blowing in that section, by the way. As with the nails biting into the wood, it conjures in my mind the actions that were taken in the moment. It means that the camera isn't just showing me an image of a soiled napkin. It means I am watching a scene directly contrasting 2 actions, the writing of the number and the blowing of the nose. And the scene is inviting me to imagine what might have happened in between those 2 moments that so changed the mind of the person who wrote the number down. You might not think that that's a particularly impressive reason to have sound effects added to the show, but you have to admit it is an explanation, and it makes a hell of a lot more sense than that the creators hate the audience, as if Stephen Moffat, Mark Gatiss and Stephen Thompson are sitting at home going, "We really hate the audience, Mark." "Yes we do, Stephen. What shall we do next? Let's put some sound effects over the image. That will really show how much contempt we have for them." Tiddlywinks isn't interested in textual reasons why certain choices might have been made. Harry doesn't explore the effects of the sounds of the nails on the wood, he simply asserts that it's for emphasis. What Tiddlywinks is doing in this section is starting from the premise Sherlock is garbage and using sections of the text to emphasise that point. But Harry doesn't do this by engaging with the TV show, he simply takes textual elements, assumes the intents behind them must have been malicious, asserts that without providing any evidence, and then moves on. This is textbook bad faith media criticism. Tiddlywinks frames Sherlock in a way so as to draw scorn from the audience by presenting it as a cynical show that attempts to manipulate the viewer with flashy effects. For example,
the bestest example ever is earlier in the episode when you have the wedding photographer taking the gang's pictures.
Okay, 3,
on, cheese.
The music swells, you get this cool time-frozen effect and all that. This shot was quite difficult to pull off. I know someone who worked on this episode. They had to build a giant rig with dozens of DSLRs all at precise positions and angles and focal distances. This is a cool technique two of my favourite directors, the Wachowskis, pioneered for The Matrix. In theory, this is a nice set of shots, right? But there's a difference between theory and practice. What is happening in these shots? How is the story being furthered? What action is being exacerbated by executing the scene with this technique? It's a few, brief, elaborate, expensive shots of people getting their picture taken at a wedding. The Wachowskis only used this technique in the most intense moments of some of the most dramatic and well-edited action scenes in film history, where a single second decompressed during a life or death moment has maximum payoff. I don't know which Burke saw this scene and thought, oh, let's do that, but for the scene where everyone's standing still. But whoever they were, they should have been fired. But I guess, since the writers accidentally wrote an episode mostly consisting of Sherlock farting about at a wedding, I guess they decided they had to blow the budget on something. By golly, I wonder who produced this show. Oh.
Is this a purposeful reference to The Matrix?
Harry is outraged that the production spent so much time and money filming this section. He never takes the time to ask why they actually made the decision to film it like that. Could it be, for example, that the show wanted to try and communicate some of the joy and wonder someone feels at their own wedding by using stylized elements to communicate that heightened emotion? Harry never considers this. In the world of Tiddlywinks, stylized elements are there to simply look flashy and have no wider artistic purpose. Harry says there are elements of the stylization he likes and some he doesn't.
I wouldn't really recommend analysing this show too much. I must mention that paying attention to sound and visuals causes the show's trick to start to wear thin very quickly.
Like? The wound's on the right side of his head.
And?
Bancoon was coffee mug handle to the left. Should he use the ones on the left? Pen and pen because he picked it up with his right and took down messages with his on the breadboard with butter on the right. Matched just the shirt and the trousers. They're pretty full.
At its best, you get intense scenes where the level of thinking being done by Sherlock is highlighted and you're put into his mind with these extreme close-ups and pauses, seeing the world how this mega genius sees it for brief spurts, and it's all very stylish. At its worst, this style is a stupid nonsense mess that ends up being needless or just straight up silly. Bing! I swear to God I didn't edit that in.
He gives no explanation as to what the difference is between the two. He just does this appeal to ridicule thing by putting the word whoosh on the screen. Also, hey look, Sherlock's Mind Palace, that's a bit like how I experience ADHD, and that's interesting. Sherlock whooshing through sections, taking the ideas Liberty, Liberty Bell, the Liberty Bell March, Liberty the Shop, and his brain just pinging between those. That's really similar to how I experience ADHD. If I don't have something actively distracting my brain, it will just ping about from point to point to point without any instructions from me, without any intervention from me. It means that for me and certain people like me, having ADHD can mean you are concentrating on something for every single moment you're awake. Your brain is either going Liberty, Liberty Bell, Liberty the Shop and so on, or you're distracting your brain by listening to some very loud music or audiobooks or some other stimulant. And that means that your brain has to be acting at a very high rate of knots for your entire waking life. And I don't think it's any wonder that most of us are just exhausted the whole time. That's not me saying you can't criticise the TV show Sherlock because I think Sherlock has ADHD. I do not think Sherlock has ADHD. I just thought it was interesting that I was watching 2 hours of Harry just rambling about how the TV show Sherlock hates its audience and I can't get it out of my head because of ADHD, and in the middle of a video there's a pretty good representation of where I can't get the show out of my head, and Harry just goes, lol, this is so stupid. Section 10, genre. Harry's main criticism of the TV show Sherlock is that the audience don't get a chance to examine the evidence for themselves, so it's a bad mystery show.
The key to mystery stories, the white, hot, burning core of the genre that makes it what it is being given information just enough that you could maybe figure out what was happening, and then having a character show you something about the information you managed to miss, or put the pieces together in a way you wouldn't expect. But to make sure you can't possibly solve it before Sherlock does, because he's supposed to be the most amazing special boy in the world, they can't risk giving you too much information. So they craft a story in which you're shown basically nothing, and then told, bing, it's a legendary serial killer I just made up. Bing, someone else told me the answer off screen.
And that is just so wrong. Mystery shows exist on a spectrum. Some focus on characterization, whilst the actual details of solving the crime are peripheral. Some focus entirely on presenting the audience with a puzzle to solve. We can imagine a line, and the line is charting what a TV show focuses on, what it thinks is really important, core to its premise. At the bottom of this line, the focus is on the characters interacting with each other, and at the top of the line, the focus is on giving the audience a puzzle to solve. Shows on every point of the line care about presenting a puzzle and presenting characterization. It's just a matter of what the show focuses on. So, on this line, where would you put Poirot and Marple? They're both classic whodunits, so I would put them right at the top. What about the shows Castle, Lucifer, and The Mentalist? Now these shows are pretty clearly character focused, so I'd put them right at the bottom. All three shows often pull the same little trick, where when the characters are interviewing the initial suspects, they only give the person that did the murder quite small, irrelevant scene, and then never go back to the murderer, spending the rest of the time chasing down loose ends. And I think that really heavily implies that they don't care about giving the viewer a puzzle to solve. What about Veronica Mars? I haven't seen this one, but I'm told it's character focused, but with a decent amount of puzzle, so we'll put it a little more in the middle. What about Jonathan Creek? That's more towards the whodunit end, but it's on a spectrum of points across the line, because some episodes are really heavily focused on presenting a puzzle to the audience, and some are more focused on comedy and Jonathan interacting with his assistant. For example, in one particularly bad episode of Jonathan Creek, they find a dead woman in a wardrobe, and the explanation is she was getting into the wardrobe for presumably normal reasons, and a big weight fell on her head, so she died in a wardrobe, and then people carried the wardrobe up the stairs and didn't notice there was a dead woman inside, and then she fell out and they went, oh, where did she come from? It wasn't great. So how about Death in Paradise? And again, Death in Paradise occupies different points on the spectrum depending on what the individual episodes are doing. Some are more focused on the puzzle, some are more focused on the characters, and some occupy a point basically in the middle. And finally, what about Sherlock? Again, I think it depends on the individual episodes. Some are focused on puzzle, some on character. My point being that there are lots of different types of mystery shows, and you can't say one is bad because it occupies a point on that scale which isn't right at the puzzle-focused end.
The show is edited as if you're supposed to, like Adler, be completely in awe of this genius, but that's never gonna happen. Contrast is required. This is precisely why puzzles are fascinating in the first place. There's a tangible, emotional reaction to figuring out how to solve something and putting something together. Similarly, for a mystery story to work, you have to be shown the problem and the clues before it's solved, so you have a chance to do it yourself and then marvel at seeing someone else find the solution.
None of this is to say that it wasn't extremely bad writing for Sherlock to posit a mystery, specifically how Sherlock survived at the end of Series 2, and not give any explanation at all. That's definitely bad. However, the rest of the show doesn't do that. It does present puzzles with answers. Harry is highly critical of Sherlock for not occupying a point on the scale right at the puzzle-focused end. Given this is pretty clearly not what the show is going for, that seems very much like him getting angry at a show for not being what he wants it to be. So the question is that anger legitimate? Do the Sherlock Holmes stories give the reader all the information in advance and allow them to solve the puzzle before Sherlock? Anyone who's ever read any of the Sherlock Holmes stories will probably already know this. No, they don't. From The Adventure of the Speckled Band. Her features and figure were that of a woman of 30, but her hair was shot with premature grey, and her expression was weary and haggard. Sherlock Holmes ran over to her with one of his quick, all-comprehensive glances. "You must not fear," he said smoothly, bending forward and patting her forearm. "We shall soon set matters right, I have no doubt. We have come in by train this morning, I see." "You know me then?" "No, but I observed the second half of a return ticket in the palm of your left glove. You must have started early, and yet you had a good drive in the dog cart along heavy roads before you reached the station." The lady gave a violent start and stared in bewilderment at my companion. "There is no mystery, my dear madam," he said, smiling. "The left arm of your jacket is spattered with mud in no less than 7 places. The marks are all perfectly fresh. There is no vehicle save of a dog cart, which throws up mud in that way, and then only when you sit on the left-hand side of the driver." "Whatever your reasons may be, you are perfectly correct," said she. Anyone passably familiar with the Holmes short story should recognise that structure. Many of them start with Holmes and Watson in their flat, and Holmes makes some observations that don't affect the plot much, but serve to establish his unique powers of observation and deduction. But that means, similarly, anyone who's read the short stories should know that Holmes often just says stuff like, "Oh, you've come in by train," or "Oh, you took a dog cart," without letting the audience work it out from the train ticket or the spattered mud. The text, in fact, gives the information in an order specifically to prevent the reader doing that, because these parts of the short story serve to remind the reader that Holmes is remarkable. He wouldn't be very remarkable if the reader could beat him to his first conclusion. But anyway, those are small deductions. What about the big ones? So, this is the conclusion of A Study in Scarlet. Having left the house, I proceeded to do what Gregson had neglected. I telegraphed to the head of the police at Cleveland, limiting my inquiry to the circumstances connected with the marriage of Enoch Drebber. The answer was conclusive. It told me that Drebber had already applied for the protection of the law against an old rival in love named Jefferson Hope, and this same Hope was currently in Europe. I knew now that I had the clue to the mystery in my hand, and all that remained was to secure the murderer. And this is the section that conclusion calls back to, which is cluing the reader in on Sherlock's processes. Have you sent to Cleveland? We telegraphed this morning. How did you word your inquiries? We simply detailed the circumstances and said that we should be glad of any information they could help us. You did not ask for particulars on any point which appeared to you to be crucial? I asked about Stangerson. Nothing else? Is there no evidence on which this whole case appears to hinge? Will you not telegraph again? I have said all I have to say, said Gregson in an offended voice. Sherlock Holmes chuckled to himself and appeared to be about to make some remark when Lestrade, who had been in the front room whilst we were holding this conversation in the hall, reappeared upon the scene, rubbing his hands in a pompous and self-satisfied manner. To be very clear, I am not claiming that Arthur Conan Doyle never gave the audience enough information to solve the mysteries in advance. Sometimes he did. In The Adventure of the Speckled Band, for example, we learn the following facts before the grand reveal. Someone was murdered in bedroom A. There is a ventilator leading from bedroom A to bedroom B, but it's too small for an animal larger than a rat to fit through. There was a functionless bell rope leading from bedroom A's ventilator to the bed, and the bed couldn't be moved. Now, if you saw past all the red herrings the story throws at you, which I've left out, it was pretty clear to work out that something small came through the vent between bedrooms A and B, which came down the bell rope and killed the occupant. What's a lot more difficult to get is that it's a deadly snake that killed the occupant. Holmes deduces the presence of a snake by finding that the murderer has a collection of creatures from India and the presence of a bowl of milk. He concludes that the snake must have been trained with the milk. This last part will be tricky for an audience to deduce, partly because it's not exactly a straight line between those 2 points, and partly because milk can't be digested by snakes and is actively harmful to them. Hashtag cancel Arthur Conan Doyle, he didn't have Wikipedia in 1892. But at the same time, that makes Harry's assertion that a study in Scarlet teaches us how to guess at someone's height and stride at best worth checking on. It might be a perfectly good way of gauging someone's height and stride, but it also might be 130-year-old pseudoscience. You know, like that bit in the Blue Carbuncle where Sherlock Holmes says the size of a person's head is a good way of guessing how clever they are. My point here is that sometimes Sherlock Holmes stories let you work out mysteries before the reveal and sometimes they don't. It's not a core feature of the stories and nor does it need to be. Just as mystery TV shows exist on the spectrum, so too do books and short stories. Some are puzzles to solve, like Agatha Christie's whodunits, but in my opinion, the Sherlock Holmes stories are closer to noir, which focuses more on atmosphere, character, and a plucky underdog foiling corrupt power structures. Notably, noir fiction doesn't necessitate a puzzle that the reader can solve, unlike whodunits. So, I've put this off for long enough. Let's deal with that point which has 3 pins stuck in it. Section 11. Harry seems to not know a whole lot about the source material. I mentioned earlier that Harry hates when shows start with the good stuff and then go back later to fill in the backstory, and how Arthur Conan Doyle did that in 2 of the 4 Sherlock Holmes novellas. If that were the only example, it might not be worth mentioning, but it's just the tip of the iceberg. Harry says,
Sherlock is too important, too special, too powerful, and this ruins the tension of the show and our ability to empathise with the character.
People make that bad faith point about Stephen Moffat's Doctor Who all the time. It's a thing people love to say about his material. Remember that user that commented under Tiddlywinks from earlier? I don't think that applies at all to Stephen Moffat's Doctor Who, and if you think it does, I would invite you to go back and rewatch some of the episodes to check. But we're not talking about Doctor Who. Sorry, I got distracted again. Sherlock, unlike Doctor Who, is a brilliant arsehole character. Like Dr. House, Jane from The Mentalist and so on, every brilliant arsehole character is amazing and special to the point where they can get away with being a prick to people. So, is that problem unique to the TV show Sherlock? I stumbled across this passage in The Adventure of the Speckled Band, which might be interesting to you. The ejaculation had been drawn from my companion by the fact that our door had been suddenly dashed open, and that a huge man had framed himself in the aperture. His costume was a peculiar mixture of the professional and the agricultural, having a black top hat, a long frock coat, and a pair of high gaiters, with a hunting crop swinging in his left hand. So tall was he that his hat actually brushed the crossbar of the doorway, and his breadth seemed to span it across from side to side. A large face seared with 1,000 wrinkles, burned yellow with the sun, and marked with every evil passion, was turned from one to the other of us, while his deep-set, bile-shot eyes and his high, thin, fleshless nose gave him somewhat the resemblance of a fierce old bird of prey. That section established that the dude who barged into Holmes's house is far bigger than Holmes or Watson. Ha! You put me off, do you? Said our new visitor, taking a step forward and shaking his hunting crop. I know you, you scoundrel. I have heard of you before. You are Holmes the meddler. My friend smiled. Holmes the busybody. His smile broadened. Holmes for Scotland Yard, Jack in office. Holmes chuckled heartily. Your conversation is most entertaining, said he. When you go out, please close the door, for there is a decided draught. I will go when I have had my say. Don't you dare to meddle in my affairs. I know that Miss Stoner, lol, has been here. I traced her. I am a dangerous man to fall foul of. See here. He stepped swiftly forward, seized the poker, and bent it into a curve with his huge brown hands. See that you keep yourself out of my grip, he snarled, and hurling the twisted poker into the fireplace, he strode from the room. He seems a very amiable person, said Holmes, laughing. I'm not quite so bulky, but if he had remained, I might have shown him that my grip was not much more feeble than his own. As he spoke, he picked up the steel poker and, with a sudden effort, straightened it out again. A big guy bending a poker, and then the much smaller Sherlock Holmes straightening it out again. Sherlock Holmes there being a clear Mary Sue. Let's try and work out how much Harry knows about the source material, given that he uses the source material as the main point of attack against Sherlock the show.
It's a farce, but it's rendered tragic by just how good Sherlock Holmes stories and adaptations can be.
Dull and posh? One of the most memorable fucking characters in, like, the history of literature? Oh yeah, he needs to be fixed.
In the books, when he's tracking down other criminals, and of course Moriarty, Sherlock has to try very hard not to get murdered, and in the original novel, literally does, because Moriarty and himself end up shuffling off the Reichenbach Falls together. In this version, Moriarty literally doesn't want Sherlock dead, and he doesn't really care about his crime empire.
In the course of his 2-hour video, Harry references the plots of a few Sherlock Holmes stories, so we can be sure he's read at the very least a few wiki summaries. He quotes an Arthur Conan Doyle story on precisely one occasion, which we've already seen. So we can be sure he's read Study in Scarlet, or we can be sure he's read bits of it, because at one point in Tiddlywinks he says this.
Assassins in the world. That is his trademark style.
And then someone off-screen finds out where he is, and then they go to where he is.
Any time you want to explain?
Homeless network really is indispensable.
Like, all the deduction and thinking isn't done in a way that is actually interesting or fun for the viewer to see.
But Conan Doyle does this exact same thing in A Study in Scarlet, from A Study in Scarlet Chapter 6. What on earth is this? I cried, for at this moment there came a pattering of many steps in the hall and on the stairs, accompanied by audible expressions of disgust on the part of our landlady. It's the Baker Street Division of the Detective Police Force, said my companion gravely. As he spoke, there rushed into the room half a dozen of the dirtiest and most ragged street... not reading that word, that I had ever clapped eyes on. Urchins, let's call them urchins. "Attention!" cried Holmes in a sharp voice, and the 6 dirty little scoundrels stood in a line like so many disreputable statues. All right, Arthur Conan Doyle. In future you will have to send Wiggins up alone to report, and the rest of you must wait in the street. Have you found it, Wiggins? No, sir, we haven't, said one of the youths. I hardly expected that you would. You must keep on until you do. Here are your wages. He handed each of them a shilling. Now off you go, and come back with a better report next time. He waved his hand, and they scampered away downstairs like so many rats, and we heard their shrill voices in the street. There's more work to be got out of one of those little beggars than out of a dozen of the force, Holmes remarked. The mere sight of an official-looking person seals men's lips. These youngsters, however, they can go everywhere and hear everything. They're as sharp as needles, too. All they want is organisation. Sherlock Holmes, pioneer of child labour since the 1890s. So these street kids are the ones who bring the murderer in A Study in Scarlet to Baker Street in Chapter 7 of the book as well. Harry wonders out loud why the camera does a Matrix move at the wedding, and then he says that the 2 pills in A Study in Pink are a Matrix reference, and...
Is this a purposeful reference to the Matrix? Like, it wouldn't be the first time they did that. They did that thing at the beginning with the 2 pills. What's the deal with these references?
Alright, if you take this pill, you wake up in your bed, and the Sherlock TV series was never made, it was all a bad dream.
The 2 pills, that's A Study in Scarlet. That's how the murderer kills the first victim and tries to do the same to the second. From A Study in Scarlet Chapter 6, when the murderer is confessing. I worked this alkaloid into small, soluble pills, and each pill I put in a box with a similar pill made without the poison. I determined at the time that when I had my chance, my gentlemen should each have a drawer out of one of these boxes, while I ate the pill that remained. It would be quite as deadly and a good deal less noisy than firing across a handkerchief. From that day, I always had my pill boxes about with me, and the time had now come I was to use them. And then later, let high God judge between us. Choose and eat. There is death in one and life in the other. I shall take what you leave. Let us see if there is justice upon the earth, or if we are ruled by chance. He cowered away with wild cries and prayers for mercy, but I drew my knife and held it to his throat until he had obeyed me. Then I swallowed the other, and we stood facing one another in silence for a minute or more, waiting to see which was to live and which was to die. Shall I ever forget the look which came over his face when the first warning pangs told him the poison was in his system? I laughed as I saw it, and held Lucy's marriage ring in front of his eyes. It was but for a moment, for the action of the alkaloid is rapid. A spasm of pain contorted his features. He threw his hands out in front of him, staggered, and then, with a hoarse cry, fell heavily upon the floor. I turned him over with my foot and placed my hand upon his heart. There was no movement. He was dead. I'm so baffled by the Matrix point Harry makes because he quotes A Study in Scarlet. Did he not read the whole book? Did he not remember the pills? Harry says again and again how great the Sherlock Holmes stories were.
So Arthur Conan Doyle didn't bother, and instead focused on telling one of the most popular and compelling mystery stories in the entire Western fucking canon. Nothing remotely like this would have happened in the short stories because they actually had a story worth telling and wanted to get to it.
Dull and posh? One of the most memorable fucking characters in, like, the history of literature? Oh yeah, he needs to be fixed.
But he seems to not remember the major plot point of one of the most famous Holmes stories out there. This isn't equivalent to misremembering a tiny detail from The Adventure of the Three Students. This is A Study in Scarlet. The first Sherlock Holmes story, one of the most famous in existence, and the only Holmes story which Harry quotes directly in Tiddlywinks. It's almost as if Harry wanted to make a bad faith point about Sherlock for betraying the source material and didn't actually care what the source material was. Harry, specifically, seems to have a beef with Moffat to the point where he just full-on ignores the co-creator of Sherlock, Mark Gatiss, for a lot of the time, and that's interesting. Gatiss and Moffat co-wrote 3 episodes of Sherlock together. Apart from those, Gatiss wrote 4 and Moffat wrote, also 4. They were equal partners in this, as far as I can tell, but a certain type of person on the internet likes to really loudly have an opinion that Stephen Moffat is the Antichrist. Don't get me wrong, Moffat has had his share of bad writing, and he said some pretty terrible things in the past, but putting everything that went wrong with Sherlock on him and completely ignoring Gatiss, who as far as I can tell is half responsible for whatever problems Sherlock has, that's weird, right? Harry spends about 20 minutes talking about Moffat's previous writing, but never mentions Gatiss's previous writing. Where's the 20 minutes of material on how you hate the League of Gentlemen, Harry? So far, maybe you've come with me on this journey, maybe you're convinced, maybe you're not, and that's fine. I have one last point to talk about. Section 12, is Harry lying or is Harry incompetent? When Harry was talking about Jekyll, he made an extremely strange point. I'm going to show you the clip Harry was talking about so you can see what's going on, and then I'm going to show you what Harry says about it.
What time of night do you call this?
In this clip, Hyde has been out drinking. Hyde's the one who just came through the door, and he's come to the safe house where he and Jekyll lives, and the woman who opened the door is the go-between between Hyde and Jekyll. So she makes him coffee.
He doesn't realise he's permanently on 4.
She tells him to drink all the coffee. He strikes a match and throws the matchbook into the air, hitting himself in the face because he's drunk. So you follow. Hyde is drunk. He's acting drunk, and that's the deal with the scene. Very simple. So here's what Harry says about it during Tiddlywinks.
By far the funniest part of the show is this outtake an editor left in that nobody seemed to notice, where Hyde uses his superpowers to pull out a book of matches and light one out of nowhere, but Nesbit accidentally flings the entire pack directly into his face and eyes. They try and cut away, but all they can cut to is this other angle of him doing the same thing. It's like, wow, do you have a take where he doesn't throw the matches into his face? No? Oh well, we have to go with this then.
No, Harry. No, it's not a mistake. Hyde is drunk. You would know that if you'd watched the 60 seconds of Jekyll that led up to that moment. So, here's my question. Is Harry lying, or is he incompetent? Did he deliberately take that Jekyll clip out of context, so he could lie about what is happening in it in order to make the creator look stupid? Who was the creator again? I'm just wondering. Ah, yes, Stephen Moffat. No reason why I mentioned that, it's just interesting. So, lying is one option, or is he so ignorant of the media he's talking about that he didn't know about what happened immediately before a clip he talks about? That section in Tiddlywinks takes place at 20 minutes and 6 seconds in, by the way, just so you can check that I'm not pulling a Tiddlywinks and misrepresenting the text. We can ask the same question about the Matrix point that Harry makes. Was he lying about the pills being a Matrix reference to make Sherlock look stupid, or was he completely ignorant of one of the key points of the source material he claims to love? I have one more example. Remember Rash?
H here is written by the victim, and it actually turns out that she really is trying to write the name Rachel, because knowing German, I guess, is too much to expect of an audience.
Those of you who have done a bit of video editing yourselves might have spotted it. In case you haven't, here's the full clip of the original show. And just for comparison's sake, here's what they are like side by side.
Sherlock goes to a crime scene clearly based on the one from Scarlet. Rach here is written by the victim, and it actually turns out that she really is trying to write the name Rachel, because knowing German, I guess, is too much to expect of an audience. This isn't necessarily a bad change. What is a bad change is what information Sherlock learns and how he learns it. We're shown Sherlock inspecting the body and instead making the conclusion, based on the inside of a dirty wedding ring being clean, that the woman is a serial adulterer. This actually doesn't have very much impact on the story whatsoever, it's just the writers finding a way to be clever.
Yes, I wish I was joking. Harry Brewis, H-Bomber Guy, the guy who raised $340,000 for Mermaids, a charity I love and have supported myself, cut the German interpretation of Rash out of his video and then snarked at the show for being the one to take it out. The really strange thing is, Harry left the German Rash in during an earlier clip.
Used to get across his sheer attentiveness. Here, for example, because she was scraping the ground with her nails, as the text appears you hear a nail scraping.
So if it's a lie he hid about as well as a toddler hiding chocolate stains on her mouth. So he must have known that the German Rash was in the show, right? So why did he snark at the show for having the name be Rachel rather than Rash? Is it possible that Harry thought Rash was some great clue in A Study in Scarlet? For those a little confused by my tone, I should point out that Rash is a red herring in A Study in Scarlet. Why should the second man write up the German word Rash before decamping? I confess I cannot see any possible way of reconciling all these facts. My companion smiled approvingly. You sum up all the difficulties of the situation succinctly and well, he said. There is much that is still obscure, though I have quite made up my mind on the main facts. As to Paul Lestrade's discovery, it was simply a blind intended to put the police on a wrong track by suggesting socialism and secret societies. It was not done by a German. The A, if you noticed, was printed somewhat after the German fashion. Now a real German invariably prints in the Latin character, so that we may safely say that this was not written by one, but by a clumsy imitator who overdid his part. I need to reiterate, I am not a Sherlock Holmes expert. I haven't read most of the short stories. I've probably read about half over my lifetime, and only a few fragments are left in my middle-aged memory today. I'm not an expert on the TV show Sherlock, but again, I do not care about Sherlock. I'm not an expert on Jekyll. I liked it when it first aired, but hadn't watched it in over a decade. Initially, I only caught Tiddlywinks' misrepresentative Jekyll clip. I thought Tiddlywinks' claim that an outtake made it into the final show was unlikely, and I thought I remembered the scene in the original show, so I went back and checked. The Matrix thing nearly slipped me by, because it was in the middle of a load of other nonsense Harry was moaning about. And I only caught the Rash misrepresentation. I only caught it because I wanted to get a clean copy of the audio for that scene, so I could talk about the sound effects of the nail and the wood. It's possible that Harry cut the German section from his clip because the BBC fairly notoriously doesn't like long clips of unedited videos, and I might have to cut my clip for similar reasons, but he didn't just cut the German Rash from the original clip, he cut the Rash, and he then said the show didn't mention it. There are at least 3 points where Harry has either lied about the text or is so ignorant about the subject matter of his 2-hour video that he should make a public apology to all of the 8 million people who have watched Tiddlywinks. What scares me is, are there any more moments like that? What moments did I miss? I found 3. Are there any others? I can feel some people going, it's only a joke. All 3 of those were clearly jokes. And I need to come back to that joke about Benedict Cumberbatch at the end of Tiddlywinks.
Also, Benedict Cumberbatch is a terrible actor and his face is stupid.
Harry presents jokes and what he presumably thinks are legitimate criticisms in exactly the same way. He says them in a snarky tone, gives no evidence, and then moves on. I don't know if nothing in this video is a joke or all of it is a joke. What I know is that people in his comments are taking it very seriously, and some of my friends, smart people who should know how to differentiate jokes and real media criticism, are repeating his points back to me verbatim. Harry named the final part of Tiddlywinks Contempt. The section is about the finale of Sherlock Series 2 and how it was really messed up to posit a question, how did Sherlock survive, before going into Series 4 and eviscerating the worst parts of that, which is fair enough. Harry's claim is this demonstrates the creator of Sherlock's contempt for the audience, although Harry only calls out one creator by name, Stephen Moffat, because of course. Who knows, maybe Mark Gatiss and Stephen Moffat do have contempt for their audience. I'm not in their heads, I don't know. I don't personally think contempt looks like that. I think contempt looks like either being so ignorant of the source material that you can't even get basic details right, or actively lying to your audience about it. If you like Tiddlywinks because it's funny, or because it's cathartic to listen to an internet dude rag on something for 2 hours, sure. I don't want to take that away from you. If you like Tiddlywinks because you think it makes good points, then you may be letting the style in which the video is presented overwhelm your critical thinking. Love Tiddlywinks for the right reasons. Love it because it rags on a show you don't like. I initially had a line in there talking about how you should like Tiddlywinks because it's harmless fun, but after finding those Matrix Jekyll and Rash clips, I'm not sure it is harmless fun. I have one thing more to say, which is I'm going to be turning the comments for this video off. I'm going to turn the like-dislike ratio off. If I could turn the view count off, I would. I do not want people in the comments saying, oh, Harry is really saying this in this clip, or oh, you said this here, but Harry says this here. I don't care. I want this video out of my life. I want this to be it. I want to be done with this. I really hope this exorcism works.